Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And there are numerous unsung pioneers of military doctrine that kind of came to surface in World War II. Jeff McGovern returns to the channel to share his insight into General Paul Williams, master of the tactical airlift and undoubtedly one of the geniuses of the war, especially regarding the deployment, delivery, and logistics behind airborne troops. So I'll bring him in now. And he's in Blighty now. You're in England now. You've joined the masses and come to the country where we speak English properly. Although I'm not there anymore.
Yeah. I can understand most people until I get to certain areas in the north, and then it's a little more difficult. But
Yeah, no, I know, I hear you. So, as I said there, top of the show, one of the things that there are undoubtedly people behind airborne doctrine that are legendary. We were just talking about James Gavin. I'm thinking of other people involved in that kind of concept with Ridgway but there are other people who just somehow have fallen through the cracks. And as someone who comes at this from both the serving side of things, the academic PhD historian, and both sides, kind of infantry, air, the whole lot there. It's curious why some people just have never been really recognized. What do you put that down to before we get into his career?
it sounds cynical. I think it's ego. Uh, I've been interested in Williams for a while now, and then trying to build this idea to write a biography about him. He just didn't leave a lot of
Mm,
information about himself, and he didn't go after the press. He's in the press every once in a while, but he doesn't go after, hey, look at me. He's the professional airman. Let's get this job done. I would say that prior to his involvement with Troop Carrier Tactical Airlift, he's actually in air support, and he's in Tunisia
mm,
supporting Friedendahl, Patton, and Bradley. And all that hubbub about, there's no air, there is air. He's right in the middle, and he's proving the doc in the new doctrine. And he takes what he gets there from Cunningham, and then they take it and expand with it. But then he's reassigned to troop carriers. So no one ever really, if you talk about Tunisian air campaign, they talk about the 12th Air Support Command. They never name the guy. It's
mm.
Williams. And so he's key in making this happen. So I think he just didn't want the focus. And if there's a number of pictures of him in here, and if you look at the expression on his face every time, he just looks like this guy who's already happy where he is.
He,
So he's
he's
not
he's
looking to.
he's Brad Dexter, Harry Luck in the Magnificent Seven. He's the
Yeah,
one when you see a picture, you remember him. And, oh yeah, that one. But you just
yeah,
kind of go, Yul Brynner, Steve McQueen, and then you go, oh yeah, they're that one. And
it is. Yep.
when you're around the likes of Patton and Cunningham and some of these other people with a bit of, if you like, showbiz about them, it makes sense that some people just go, okay, well, I'm gonna be in the back row. Someone has to be in the back row. We can't all be at the front clamoring for the microphone and being there. So, and
Yep.
just as you say, let his deeds speak for him. But of course, historians sometimes have followed the paper trail of those that spoke about it a lot because they spoke about it a lot, and it's easier to find. But anyway, we'll bring up the slides and
Yep.
folks,
When you're
the
talking
other
about him hiding in the background, he's 6'1". So
yeah, he
he's
somehow
always
blends
easy to
in.
identify in a picture, even though he's not identified in the picture.
Yeah,
Uh,
brilliant.
so,
So over to you,
so
Jeff.
Okay, so I've just got this list of this is I'm an ex-ground guy, infantry, paratrooper, all that, and so my focus used to be on the ground part of war, and then I got this job as a historian in the Air Force, and it's kind of switched me to taking in air power. So now it's three-dimensional, and I've expanded on my idea of what does it take to understand the past. You got to know the whole context, right? Nobody fights or supplies or does something alone. It's always interconnected. With stuff. So when I get my first job was with the 12th Air Force, and so I started digging into their past, and then I was their Air Support Command, and then their Troop Carrier Command, and I saw this guy's name listed twice essentially, and I said, well, what's going on with this? How do you go from Air Support, Pete Caseta and Wayland and all those guys, or Troop Carrier? And so I started to look up what he is, and so right on this slide, I've just got this list of his commands in the Second World War. He goes, and we'll go into a little more detail later. This won't be like a chronological story of his life, but it'll talk about high points. In Algeria, he's 51st Troop Carrier Wing Commander. So he takes over right as they're finishing the planning to drop into Algeria with the 2nd of the 503rd. And then he's there for a little bit, and then he gets, and we'll talk about the politics in a minute, he takes command of the 12th Air Support Command, and he takes that through the Tunisian campaign. And then at the end of that, he gets he goes back to the Troop Carrier Command. He takes up the first command of the first Troop Carrier Command, the Northwest African Air Force Troop Carrier Command, and he takes him into Sicily, right? And then with all that happens in Sicily, right, he's not fired. He stays there. He actually goes back to the States, participates in the swing board. He comes back. He's now the 12th Troop Carrier Command. He takes them into Italy. And then it's already been written in the stars that he's going to be the one and 9th Troop Carrier Command going into the ETO. Moves up to north into England, 9th Troop Carrier Command into northern France. He comes back to the Mediterranean to do the Dragoon with a provisional troop carrier division. Then he goes back and he takes 9th Troop Carrier Command all the way through to the end of the war. And after the war, he actually takes him home, and he becomes the troop carrier commander inside of the States at the end of the war. So he's involved in all of these operations, and some of them, especially the earlier ones, right? Or if you're especially depending on your angle on it, they're disasters. People point fingers and need to be blamed. He survives all of this and continues to be the commander of it, even though they keep saying, "Oh, troop carrier messed up. Troop carrier messed up." There's more to the story. Troop carrier didn't just mess up; otherwise, this guy would have been out on his heels, I think. So,
yeah, absolutely.
And there's that expression. He's going to have this expression in nearly every picture that he's taken. He just looks like a happy guy, right? He looks like my grandfather, even though he's only in his 50s, right there. So he starts out as a pilot. He enlists at the end of World War One in that sort of fur in the United States, and he goes into the Air Corps or the Air Service, and then the Air Corps, and he's a pilot, and then he becomes a pilot instructor in the 20s and 30s. And if you read his efficiency reports, he's kind of average. But the longer he's in and the more responsibility he gets, in his efficiency reports, they start saying, "Oh no, he's actually superior, and he's starting to exceed." And so he eventually goes to this professional military education school called the Air Corps Tactical School in 1937. And then after that, kind of his career takes off. Once he graduated, he gets the command of a squadron, which is the 90th Attack Squadron, which they flew that plane that's up on the upper left there. And then after that, he gets moved up to the unit that's above the 90th, the 3rd Bombardment Group, and he's on staff, and then chief of staff, and then he becomes the commander of that. And then he becomes the commander of the next unit up is a guy named Asa Duncan, who has noticed Williams, and he takes Williams after the 3rd Bomb Group up into the 3rd Air Support Command. And this is a new kind of thing the Air Force, so the Army Air Force Air Corps is developing, which is, okay, we need to have units dedicated to support the ground. And they're in competition with the bomber mafia, right? Which is the strategic guys. All you need is bombers to reach the inland and destroy it, and that's all you've done, and you're good. That's not reality, though.
You mentioned the bomber mafia there, and one of the things, because I was at the Lafayette unveiling of the 8th Air Force Monument a few days ago, and in hearing some of the speeches there, reminded me again that, you know, Hap Arnold, Hugh Doolittle, going back to the years, going back to kind of the Billy Mitchell era and Ira Aker and all those kind of guys there. There was a real sort of club mentality in some ways to the sort of the colonel and lower ranking generals kind of in the 1930s. Does he in any way kind of move in those circles, or is he sort of separate to that?
He's in that group, so he know it's a very small Air Corps, so they all know each other. So he knows Brereton, Arnold knows him, Spots knows him, all these Aker knows him. Cooter, who's one of the bomber mafia, is at the school when he's there. So he's in this mix of it, except for whatever, and I'm not sure why. He's pushed either himself or he's pushed not into the bomber strategic world, but into the tactical world, and so he goes into the attack aviation world. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it was his choice or somebody else's choice with it, but he excels at it, and he takes the 90th to various exercises and onto displays, and he gets lots of kudos for the work that he does with the squadron in support of ground forces and training with it. So
I think that's we'll get into this later, Jeff, but it seems to be very early on. He is able to spin more than one plate. He seems to understand the difficulties of supply and transport and ground and air and working all these things together. Whereas you have some incredibly brilliant airmen who are very, very brilliant at one aspect of it. You know, I don't know, accurate bombing or yep, you know, shooting down enemy aircraft. Would it be? He seems to be just very good at that. Combined arms, I suppose, is a broad brush term for that ability to, as the Allies got into the war, to be able to run everything at the same time.
Yeah. You know, in an attack, like you're saying, attack aviation, it's not just the bomber hitting the city or the industry, you have to actually work with the Army. So you have to develop a sort of
Yeah.
jointness to you, and you have to be able to speak to one another. And they have to know what you want, you have to know what they want, and they're two opposites. So
Yeah.
he apparently had this knack of being able to speak to the ground forces and develop a team effort and successfully do that. Um, and then in this early sort of transition into the war, Spots is one of those guys, key guys, and he's a strategic guy, but he also speaks tactically, which is probably why he has the trajectory that he is that he's also one of those multifaceted folks versus the sort of the central folks.
Okay.
Duncan is at the 3rd Air Support Command in early 42, and he gets tied up with Bolero, Operation Bolero, which is to stand up the forces in the UK and start that strategic bombing campaign against Germany with the 8th Air Force in England. So when they activate the 8th Air Force, the first commander is Asa Duncan. And Asa Duncan takes his staff, the guys he wants, with him from 3rd Air Support Command into the 8th Air Force. And one of those guys is Williams. And so Williams takes that next step into the 8th Air Force and the headquarters staff, and he's going to be there for a little while. Then he goes to the 8th Ground Air Support Command and a staff, and then he becomes the chief of staff. And that's what he does in 1942 in England for the most part. So he's there helping establish the 8th Air Force, and not to go too deep in the weeds, but this thing called the numbered Air Force, the 8th Air Force, 12th Air Force, is something new. And then how is it structured? Does it have bombers? Does it have fighters? Does it have medium bombers? Does it have light bombers? Does it have dive bombers? Does it have transport? And initially, they tried to throw everything into one numbered Air Force, which was the 8th and the 12th. And they quickly learned that that's not going to work that way. But so Williams is in this 8th Air Force watching all of these different things having to be developed, the logistics piece of it, all the air depot support of it. And he's involved in all of that growing. But then he's pushed or asked to go into back to that tactical air with the Ground Air Support Command. Right. And so here he is on staff in England, and there's Colonel Asa Duncan, and then Paul Williams, and then some of the other key A staff, the operations, the S, and the kind of the intelligence operations, logistics planning, and all that kind of stuff. And there's Williams sitting there with the early staff of the 8th Air Force. This is before Spots comes over, because these are the guys running the 8th. Unfortunately, Duncan's going to get.
Such, I am listening to you. That's such a boy band album cover, isn't
Yes.
it? There's a photographer going, no, you can't all do the same pose. Someone do the arm. You're the sexy one. You do the It's such that I can just see that album. Yeah, the ballads of the 8th Air Force.
Guy in the back right he's bucking the system though. He's got dark OD pants on. Everybody else has got their.
That's why they put him in the back. Yeah. He's the Robbie Williams. He's the one who's going to leave for a solo career early on. God, we've gone down a massive rabbit hole. I do apologize, Jeff. I'm in a funny mood.
Yeah. So this is one of those, it's before things ramp up. So you're going to see pictures of people, and then when things ramp up in Africa, there's almost no pictures of Williams because he's too busy doing stuff. So this is one of those times when he's there. Now, Asa Duncan is that guy who took him with him. Yeah. And he's kind of, it's all, I think it's about it's relationships and who you work with and who you don't work with and how well you work with them. And if you have senior commanders who rate you as one of those guys who is capable, efficient, and a team player, then you can move along with them. And Asa Duncan takes Williams with him from Savannah, Georgia, 3rd Air Support Command into the 8th Air Force and pushes him off on a certain trajectory. Unfortunately, Duncan is going to get killed in November on the way down to North Africa, and then some things change again. He doesn't have that guiding star anymore, but then he has another one, Spots. Right? So he's in England, and then is it 8th Air Force is a composite air force, and so they want troop carrier, which is this new thing about delivering airborne forces, and Operation Bolero, which is the buildup of forces in England. There's an element of there when we're going to cross the channel, we're going to use airborne, this new force. And so 8th Air Force is supposed to be that Air Force, and so it's going to be have an air support command. And there's the Air Force, Army Air Forces is sending over organizations. They send over the 51st Troop Carrier Wing, and at that time they decide to not have the 8th Air Force Troop Carrier Command activated. And so Williams then gets assigned as the 51st Troop Carrier Command. He replaces the guy who brought him over. Somebody decided that the wing commander that brought the 51st to the UK wasn't going to cut it in combat, and they send him back to the States, and Williams gets the job. Williams gets the job also over another guy, a guy named Dunn, There's a picture of them on the right-hand side there.
Yeah.
You can see Williams kind of with the crew cut, and the guy over his right shoulder, that's Dunn, Ray Dunn. He came over with the early 8th Air Force and stood up the 8th Air Force Troop Carrier Command. But when they bring the 51st over, they don't give the 51st to Dunn, they give it to Williams. And this is not the first time that these two are going to kind of be in competition about who's supposed to lead Troop Carrier Command. They're relatively in the same place in their careers because that's them both in their Air Corps Tactical School last photo right there. So they know each other and they've been working with each other for quite some time. Dunn is not going to survive, unlike Williams, going to keep on moving forward. So he takes 51st Troop Carrier Wing, which had 3 troop carrier groups, the 60th, the 62nd, 64th. The 60th is the one that brings the 2nd of the 503rd in Algeria. The 64th is the one that brings the 1st Parachute Brigade into Algeria. And the 62nd falls along and basically does supply stuff. Williams is not a guy to shy away from combat. And on the 29th of November, I think there were 6 drops, maybe I'm wrong with that, in Algeria, Tunisia by either US or UK Airborne, all delivered by the 51st Troop Carrier Wing. Williams leads the 29th November drop of the 2nd Parachute Battalion into Dieppe, Tunisia, which the drop goes really well. The operation after that is a whole different ball of wax. But the troop carrier gets them there, and Williams is in the lead. So he's actually saying, okay, I'm a troop carrier leader. I'm going to be out there. I'm actually going to do it. I'm not just going to sit behind my desk. So he gets the taste of what it means to fly in and do that. And then again, the Army Air Force is still figuring out what this numbered Air Force thing is. So this is now 12th Air Force. 12th Air Force in North Africa is trying to figure out, how do I control all this space? They create these things called composite wings, which is really an admin headquarters, and they dual hat Williams as the troop carrier commander, and this guy, the commander of Central Algerian Composite Wing, which is really running admin stuff for 12th Air Force. And the 51st doesn't drop anybody basically in December, except for the LGM raid, and January. And what the 12th does is use them to move supplies. Right? Northern Africa is really rough. There's kind of one road. There's one narrow gauge railroad with a couple of coming to the south off of it. But if you want to move stuff in North Africa, you got to fly it. And the only planes that can fly it are the 51st Troop Carrier Wing. And now flying is absolutely key. Right? How am I going to get the bombers and the fighters and all the supplies forward? I'm going to use the 51st Troop Carrier Command. But that means that they're not doing airborne training. Right? So their skill set as being an airborne training, dropping airborne divisions or battalions at the time, is going away. As they're moving, the U.S. military is moving into Tunisia, right? The idea is to capture Tunis really quick, but then the winter weather hits and the campaign stops in mid-December. Right? And so now they're going to move up Second Corps, they're going to move up more forces, and they're going to get ready to launch an offensive in January. So there's a pause. And in that pause, 12th Air Support Command, Ground Air Support Command or Air Support Command, moves up. And they're the Air Force element that's supposed to support Second Corps with tactical aviation, right? Air interdiction, close air support, and all that. It's had a mixed life in Algeria. It's had 3 different commanders. They get a guy named Howard Craig to become the commander, and he takes over on the 10th of January. And that's roughly when Friedendahl and Second Corps show up also in Tunisia. So you get sitting right next to each other, 12th Air Support Command under Craig and Second Corps under Friedendahl, and they're supposed to be working with one another. This is a lot of names and confusions. Doolittle is the 12th Air Force commander. Doolittle doesn't like Craig, and he doesn't think Craig is doing a good job. So Doolittle speaks to his boss, Spots, and he says, hey, Craig needs to get out, and I want Williams in. And Spots says, well, Craig is good. What's going on? And so Spots goes, visits him, comes back. Doolittle still says, I want him out. I want Williams in. Now, Williams knows Spots because of their work in England, and so he also knows of Williams' work as a tactical air guy before he becomes 8th Air Force. So he gives the job to Williams on the 22nd of January, and he holds the job as Air Support Command commander, all the way through the whole campaign in Tunisia. And if if you follow the Tunisian campaign from a cloud top version, it's always discussed that the air is never there. The U.S. air is never there. U.S. air is there. Why aren't they there? They're just not supporting us, right, from a ground perspective. But if you actually read the reports, that's not the case. What is the case is that the terrain in Tunisia is horrendous. And where do you put airfields? And how do you get the logistics to support the airfields? And that airplane there, the P-39, is the main ground attack airplane, right? Which is not the most efficient or plane, but it's what they have. And so, and they only have a handful of them. And so the 12th Air Support Command is always present, but they can't be everywhere because there's just not enough planes. I think looking backwards, when we think about tactical air, we think of when they're in Europe and Pete Caseta and Ninth TAC, when they've got an abundance of airplanes and you can have planes sitting above you flying pretty much everywhere. But in the beginning of the war, that is not the case.
I want to ask you about the importance of North Africa in terms of just learning how to do things. Now, we've talked in the past on this channel about the British and the Commonwealth troops and Conningham and people like that, and who's the other guy that Mike Bechtold did a show about? It'll come to me later on. Of the the deliberating this. Do the troops on the ground tell the air power what to do, or do the air power tell the ground people what they can do? And how do you reach that compromise of objectives? And I think the question I want to ask you is that there is this debate that the whole North Africa campaign was a waste of time. I don't go along with that. It's all to do with Mediterranean supplies, but it's, even if that was true, even if there was no actual strategic reason to be in North Africa, it's the period where, particularly in terms of close air support and air operations generally, without the extended combat training environment of North Africa, you wouldn't have seen the eventual organizational success of things like Neptune and Dragoon and things later on. Do you agree with that?
I absolutely do. That's why I'm saying, like, Williams gets zero credit for helping develop Air Support Command, but it's him, and then Cooter and Cunningham are going to come into play, right?
Yeah.
And actually Williams pushes back on Cunningham and how they do it, and Williams wins the argument because the Spots is on his side, and so it is all about cutting your teeth about how are we going to do this? How are we going to fight as a combined arms element?
Yeah.
Not only within the United States, but then also with our allies. Initially they were mixing them back and forth. They did it on ground. They did a little bit on air. They were trying to mix U.S. units with U.K. units in the air and the ground, and it just down to like the battalion and regiment level, and it just didn't work, primarily because of logistics. Once you go up higher, you got a division or a battalion or a brigade, division or a corps. That's a different thing because they have their own logistics piece to it. So it is really about cutting your teeth on how to do this. The one thing that Williams does is he always makes sure that the 12th Air Support Command headquarters is co-located with the Second Corps, right with their headquarters, so that when something comes into Second Corps that says I need support, there's the air guys right there saying I can or can't do it, and this is how it goes. And Williams always was an advocate of, you don't tell me what to do, you tell me what you need, and I'll see what I can give you to execute it, right?
Yeah,
And
I'll
the
tell you
ground
how
guys
I
are
can
like,
do it. Yeah.
because I
We've
know
had a
my
couple of
weapons.
comments I want to just kind of bring in, because we've got obviously experts in the sidebar there. So John Sauber is saying there just seems to be a large amount of growing pains through the Algeria-Tunisia period. I'd agree with that wholeheartedly. And Trentelenko, tactical air power in North Africa was also where the US Army Air Force started learning how to integrate radar into air defense and tactical air support. I've learned more from RAF signals histories than the US Army Air Force. Now, so people are agreeing that it's the learning while you're learning on the job and ironing out and improving, as I say, growing pains from John is a great way, I think, of describing it there.
I think sometimes they make there's also this idea that there's tension between the RAF, Western Desert Air Force, and coming to tell the Americans how to do the work, as we learn how to cut our teeth on it. And I think it's often forgotten. Well, the Western Desert Air Force just learned how to do what they did 6 months, 4 months beforehand.
Yeah, they're
So
like
were
one chapter ahead in the book, maybe.
Yeah, which is fine. And Williams was one of those guys who was open to, okay, let's figure out how we can do this, and then and fight this fight. So he, Friedendahl gets fired, but Williams stays on. Patton comes in, and Patton is, there's a little side story here with Patton. He works with Patton. The problem with Patton was Patton would move his headquarters, or he would leave his main headquarters and go off on his own, and then he was out of touch with the air guys. He's replaced by Bradley. Bradley's the same idea, but there's a little bit of conflict because of the way the structure in North Africa goes. As the battle space gets smaller, right? Who actually does the fighting and controlling? So you got British First Army with Second Corps, U.S. Second Corps, and there's a French Corps in there. Who controls what? And then you've got the 12th Air Support Command, and you've got 242 Group. Who's going to, as the battle space gets smaller, not everybody can have a piece of the pie.
Right.
And for the most part, the U.S. forces are put under Brits, which creates a little bit of conflict because of the way they talk to one another. In Tunisia, the British First Army and 242 Group was not Cunningham and Western Desert Air Force. They did not fight the way they did there, and they had a giant learning curve, just like 12th Air Support Command had. So Western Desert Air Force was just, and Cunningham and Broadhurst were just on the lead for it.
Yeah, I've always maintained for people who watch this channel regularly that I've always maintained that it's Operation Torch and the campaign in North Africa that is arguably the low point of US-UK relations in terms of the ETO and particularly the Mediterranean theater operations, and the rifts aren't deep. They're not damaging. It's not one family leaving the family and never talking to them again. But it's a low point that then is built on, so that by the time you get to 44 and Neptune and Dragoon and Salerno, Avalanche, all that kind of stuff, is that the teething problems kind of have gone. There is obviously there's going to be tension later on, and Market Garden and Montgomery and things like that. But I think Torch was the low point that they all had to kind of go through to come out the other side.
Yeah, I think what helps that is Eisenhower's idea about we're coalition partners. If you talk bad about one or the other, you're out. So you want to be here, you got to be a team player, and it takes a while for it to sink through. But I think that one piece of leadership is key to help build that long-term coalition. And it's, it cuts its, like you're saying in Tunisia, the First Army commander, British First Army Commander Anderson, never holds another field command after this because he doesn't know how to play. Right? His chief of staff is the same thing. They don't know how to play a coalition fight. Yeah. And so they're done for in the war.
And you can't build trust overnight. Trust comes with time. Trust and to be able to depend on your allies comes with time. And I had a great comment here from Mr. Frickenfrack. And guess they had to learn how to argue before they learned to cooperate. And that's a kind of good way of putting it. They had to learn how to kind of manage the disagreements so they can come out the other side. But anyway, we're digressing into talk about the ally relationship. But I think it's such a key point to this part of the war. It's sort of a tension that needs to, it's the elephant in the room.
Yeah. And to that, it's I don't know if there's a picture of it. So these are the key players in the campaign. So on that top right, you've got Cunningham, who becomes the Northwest African Tactical Air Force commander. His deputy commander is the guy Cooter, who's one of the bomber mafia, but he's actually a tactical guy here. Tedder's the overall theater air commander. Spots is the American, he's the Northwest African guy. He's the one who handles the stuff in Algeria. Down below is Anderson, the first British Army commander, with Bradley, because Bradley becomes a corps commander and has to work with Anderson. They don't get along. Lower left hand is Friedendahl, who's fired. And then up on the top left is, of course, General Patton, and it's when he's leaving and he's heading to take command of Second Corps. And the small inset picture is a guy named Richard Jensen, which I know you've talked about on your channels a couple of times. But actually, Williams is involved with this, and it has to do with coalition working together or not. Williams almost got famous in the Patton movie. And there's a scene in the Patton movie where an American and a Brit come to Patton and apologize about the Air Corps stuff, and these two Luftwaffe bombers come in and raid the town and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't that. It was the guys who came to visit him on the 2nd of April, Spots, Tedder, Cooter, and Williams. And the Luftwaffe actually did bomb. That part was true. The rest of it is all kind of cocky. Right. Yeah. What the whole thing was about was on the 1st of April. Sorry, the historian's name just the guy who does Heimel, right? Kevin Heimel. He was talking about Dick Jensen, and he gets killed on the 1st of April in an air raid. And Patton is distraught. And so on the 2nd of April, he sends out a sit rep and he makes sure everybody gets it. And he's just belittling the air power and the air support for the lack of it, that is missing. They're nowhere to be found. And by this time, Cunningham is now in charge of all the tactical air force. Cunningham replies, right? It's almost similar to something that's happening today in the United States, going back and forth with messages to everybody about saying something. And Cunningham replies and says, well, it's not really you, it's the guys on the ground. Ike gets a hold of this, Spots gets a hold of this, Spots and goes, what the hell is going on? Ike says, you got to get this straightened out. So Spots goes forward with Cooter. He grabs and Tedder. They grab Williams, and they go to Patton's headquarters. They show up at Patton's headquarters, and they say, you know, what's going on here, Georgie? And he says, what? I'm getting great air support. Except for that this guy Cunningham is doing it. What is going on with Cunningham? And so then these guys leave Patton's headquarters, and then they go back, and then they get to Cunningham, and Cunningham, Ike and Spots and Tedder tells Cunningham, you got to send an apology or withdrawal of your reply to George Patton's sit rep. And so then he goes to visit George Patton on the 3rd of April, and they have a verbal duke it out, and then everything's fine. But because of that one little incident, because Dick Jensen's killed, Patton's distraught, right? He's an emotional guy, I guess. And he sends out this sort of non-thinking message, sit rep, that explodes. Cunningham explodes back. But in the meantime, what's happening at the tactical level? It's business as usual. And they're getting support, right? So it's all of this it's the egos fighting one another. And that is often what's used as an example of kind of, oh, they don't work with each other. They don't talk to one another. Maybe at the very top, but at the tactical level where Williams is with 12th Air Support Command, he's there doing the job with Second Corps in the fight. You know, weather
and a
is
public
a bad
spat isn't necessarily representative of the actual day-to-day operations. And James Holland makes that point, is if you want to find jibes and gripes between Montgomery and all these other different, you can find them, but you can also find the minutes of the meetings where everything goes pretty smoothly and all the memos going back and forth where there aren't these personal attacks. So it's, over the years, we've kind of been drawn to these moments when we say in English, the teddy gets thrown out of the pram. But sometimes they're not representative of the actual ongoing. And I say there's always a staff. There's always a staff of people there to just keep things going.
And that's what, we were talking about. Why doesn't Williams get into isn't that well known? He doesn't get into these frays. He's there. He's professional airman. He's doing his job with 12th Air Support Command, making sure with the forces that he has under the weather conditions that they're there, supporting Second Corps as they go forward. And so he's just not part of that story, even though he was actually there in all the way through it. He just doesn't make the picture, right? When the campaign's over, Spots, in Spots's diary, he basically says, I don't want Williams to be the 12th Air Support Commander anymore. He's too close to the ground forces, right? So there's that old bomber mafia kind of showing up again. We're not there to support the Army only, the ground forces. We're actually our own entity, and we have our own way of fighting. And there's an idea that Williams is too close to it. So when Spots' efficiency report for Williams at this period, he says he's suitable for commander as a numbered Air Force or at the troop carrier command level. So he kind of basically is trying to steer him away. He doesn't say he did a bad job. In a way, Spots may think he's done too good of a job, right? Showing that the relationship is too close to one another. So he takes him out and he puts him, this is the reports here. And if you have a chance ever to read this report, the end of it is, this is Williams, I'm convinced that our air support was effective with experience gained. There's no doubt in my mind that outstanding accomplishments along air support lines within the American forces can be expected. And so he's all about the system that we have. If we just give it a chance to work it out, which we just did in the Tunisian campaign, we're going to have an effective air-ground system. And this reports and what they develop in the theater is actually what's taken into Sicily, what's taken into Italy, which is then brought up into France and across Europe. And it begins here in the Tunisian campaign under Williams. He gets zero credit for it.
Which is why you're here.
Yeah. After this, he goes back to the troop carrier. So he goes from being a wing commander up to the next level, which is the command, and he takes over the Northwest African Air Force's troop carrier command. It had already been activated under Dunn, and Dunn was the guy that was up in England that didn't get the 51st Troop Carrier Command. And so Dunn activates this organization, but Williams comes in and replaces Dunn, and Dunn gets, if you want to say, demoted down to the 51st Troop Carrier Wing. And so Dunn he gets he's a little bit grudging later on about what happens with it. But Williams is put as the senior guy. The only experience Williams had with troop carrier was his short time with the 51st Troop Carrier Wing. But the leadership puts him in there because he is that ground air guy. He can speak to the Army, and the Army can speak to him, and they can develop a relationship of trust. And troop carrier is all about trust between ground and air. It has to be, otherwise it doesn't work with it. Right. He comes into it as the commander as they're planning Husky, or the invasion of Sicily and all the elements of it. Ladbrokes, Fusti, and Husky. And then if you look on the bottom right, they don't call it Husky 2, they call it a McCall White. That's the second one for the 504th. In the original in the Air Force's planning, the 82nd may have called it a different thing. And so he rolls in there, and now he's got to take on this mission set of moving 2 troop carrier wings, because a new one came in, the 52nd, and he has to organize and plan all the higher level engagements in order to make this happen. Why is this a big deal? I'm not going to go too much into it because you've done other shows on it, but the Airborne into Sicily is kind of the first step on making Allied Airborne a viable tool for weaponry. And he's the guy who has to deliver them. And they have to work out all those bits and bobs about, okay, I've got an airfield here, I've got the ground guys here, how do I get them together? How do we train together? If you bring a ground guys onto the airfield, they have to have their supplies. So we got to get all that kind of stuff linked up. Then we got to figure out how to load them on the airplanes, what guys go on what planes, where are they going to go in the formations, who gets delivered first, who gets last, how do we communicate with one another? All of this has to be sort of worked out, because this is the first large-scale airborne operation that the U.S. has ever conducted. Same with the Brits. Now, there was a couple small things beforehand, but this is this first sizable thing. In theory, it's 2 divisions, even though they won't be operating as a division kind of thing. And Williams is the guy who organizes it all. What is he up against? Well, he's up against a Navy that doesn't trust anything that flies once they're in the water, because the Luftwaffe has been such a potent, and the Italian Air Force, a potent force, that when they're out there, if it's above them, they're thinking it's the enemy. So how do I get them to not shoot at me when it's Allied forces coming over, right? How do I get to my drop zones and my landing zones? Now, initially, when they're planning the invasion of Sicily, the gliders for the 82nd are part of the plan. Most of the time, that's not part of the story. There's a kind of line, 51st Troop Carrier worked with gliders, didn't work with gliders, but the 52nd Troop Carrier Wing did work with gliders. But when it came to moving the gliders into Sicily, the 51st Troop Carrier Wing, who hadn't worked with gliders, took the Brits in. Why didn't they have the 52nd do it? Well, because the 52nd was going to fly the 82nd's gliders in, glider forces in, right? And that's doesn't normally make the conversation, and it doesn't make the conversation because they never needed them to do it. But that didn't mean they did not need to be prepped and ready to execute. So 52nd Troop Carrier Wing had to be ready to move the glider forces of the 82nd in, even though they didn't do it. Right? And so 51st took it. And another thing, the 52nd Troop Carrier Wing came over with the 82nd Airborne Division, so they had worked together about that working together. They had already trusted each other. 82nd wasn't interested in working with the 51st Troop Carrier Wing and strangers. They want to work with the guys they know. Right? So Williams, as the commander, has to say, how am I going to divide my forces up? And so he goes, 52nd Troop Carrier, you work with the 82nd, you guys know each other, you work together. 51st Troop Carrier Wing, you've already worked with Brits, you're going to work with the Brits, bringing them into Sicily. Right? So that's a normal finger pointing thing that says, well, they should have had them swapped around because these guys do this. William had to make that decision, but he made that decision based on the information that he had, which to me was good information.
I have to confess, I in my earlier years, I used to think that because it was on the surface a smaller airborne operation, that Husky was easier, quote unquote, than some of the bigger ones coming up later on. But thanks to the people like yourself today, and Mike Peters and Mark Vlahorst and others coming on over the years, that the complications of the air plan for Husky they're off the charts, and you know, air supremacy or air superiority hasn't been achieved yet by the Allies. There's distances involved. There's multiple countries. There's people taking off from different. It's a real uphill struggle. And if anyone came out of that one no one was going to come out of that one without some finger pointing, because of course what happened. But it's complicated.
Yeah, and the Navy, the amphibious operation, massive. And then the ground, we were saying, North Africa is the testing ground or the development ground. Okay, let's try out what we developed in Tunisia into Sicily. And it's just a matter of, I think, and you've said often, it's building the skill set on experience, right? And Husky is in the Sicily, Ladbrokes, Faustina are all part of that. And I won't go into the sort of the Ladbrokes stuff because you've already done that.
Yeah.
Who's to blame and who's not to blame. And it's finger pointing. There was one commentator before who said, the British would never fly, glider pilots would never be towed by the Army Air Forces again. Well, who towed the horses into Dragoon was the 435th Troop Carrier Group. So they do go back to working with one another, right? Maybe that day they said they would never do it, but in the future they work as a coalition and they work together.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Williams is also now beginning to build a relationship, because on top there is Ridgway, and on the bottom, standing looking at the camera, is Gavin, right? So Gavin goes in on the first day, Tucker's with the 504th on this 2 days later, Ridgway goes in on ship. But Williams is building that relationship with the Airborne, right? So there's a sense of trust. So when they go deciding where my drop zone is, and they say, I want a drop zone here, the air guy says, well, I can't go there because X, Y, and Z. They are now developing, okay, I get it. You can't go there. So where can we go? Right. So they're starting to build that relationship of trust with it. And then, even how do you find the DZ? Normally the idea of pathfinders comes out of the operations in Sicily, and that using of Rebecca and Eureka and all that. Well, they use Rebecca and Eureka for the torch, the second of the 503rd. It just didn't work. And actually, they deployed Rebecca and Eureka into Sicily. But again, it wasn't Pathfinders. It was the equipment got lost. They were just untrained. So Williams is trying to establish a system. How am I going to find the drop zones in the night, right? And so he's beginning that system of developing a Pathfinder force. It's in the meld. It's gonna keep going from here, especially after Sicily's operation. Out of Sicily becomes this threat to the U.S. Airborne and the troop carrier, which is Eisenhower says, I never want anything larger than a regimental jump. I don't need a division. There's already 2 divisions activated. McNair he's also hesitant about it, but Marshall and Arnold love the Airborne and want to push with it. So they form a board under this guy, General Swing, who's the 11th Airborne Division commander. There were 3 activated. And he brings in all the experts. Williams leaves the theater and goes back in August of 43 to participate in the swing board. And what he's bringing in is actual field experience in the execution of an airborne operation, and from the Pacific with NADSAP too. And so Swing comes up with this report. The swing board comes up with this report, which is a little bit of an excerpt there, that's going to turn into something called the Training Circular Number 113. And this document is kind of the key to understanding how the two are supposed to work together. Force structure, who commands in the air, who commands on the ground, and all that. And they basically say this is a viable option. We're going to do a large scale exercise in December 43 called the Knollwood exercise in the States to prove it. But it's them sitting down with one another saying, okay, we've been in the junior league. This is becoming serious. We actually need to sit there and work out with one another, air and ground, on how to execute ourselves as divisions or larger in order to be able part of this theater force of Airborne. Williams comes back after this, and then he rolls back right into the Operation Avalanche and supporting Clark's landing in Italy. And that has at least 5 different plans that he has to come up with. There are 2 or 3 or 4 on how to bring a company, the Fifth Army in. There's one, of course, to go to Rome if Italy surrenders. And so Williams, with the ground, have to come up with all these different viable options. And again, one of them is to bring the gliders, the 82nd Airborne gliders, into Italy. They don't end up doing it, but they have to plan and get ready to do it, which means, what does that mean? Well, that means they have to have the glider forces there, which means the pilots and the airplanes. And then they have to have the 325 and the 907, all the glider forces be able to know how to load and unload and where to go for the airfields. So they're basically practicing how to execute it. And in the meantime, they've developed a Pathfinder force under Williams, under Colonel Crouch, and the Pathfinders deploy. And then the 2 drops into Italy, well, 2 of the 3 drops into Italy work splendidly, the 505 and the 504. The Avellino drop with the 509th is a bit of that's a bit of chaos. That had to do with piss poor planning and quickness of the operation part of it. But otherwise, it goes really well. In the meantime, Williams is making those connections again. So there's Williams in the photo. He's the one looking down at the piece of paper. To his left is Hap Arnold, right? Nobody gets promoted or generals wise or moves around to different commands without Arnold's permission, right? Right. It's the same way with Marshall with the regular Army. Arnold does the same inside the Army Air Forces. And to the left of Arnold is Mark Clark, the 5th Army commander, and all the way on the left is George Patton, who's just kind of twiddling his thumbs in Sicily, waiting for whatever the next assignment is going to be, which we know is going to be going into the United Kingdom. But Williams is basically showing himself to these other senior leaders, right? He's part of the team.
Yeah. We had a question earlier on, Jeff, from Kevin about, was criticism Williams received after Sicily deserved? And I think you've pretty much sort of explained that now, that it's not really criticism at him. It's an evaluation of the system and reports written to improve it for the next time. But as you said at the beginning, he isn't a particularly, he didn't leave many memoirs. He didn't put his version of things. So is it sort of the case that he ended up becoming a bit of a scapegoat for things because he didn't talk?
Williams is never the scapegoat. Somehow he never gets the finger pointed out, right? And I don't know how he did it. So these are the Sicily, into the Sicily maps. Williams argued, and his staff, right? He's got a really good staff, which is absolutely key for a commander. The complicated navigation plan to get the troops into Sicily. Williams hated it. It's way too complex. There's too many things that can go wrong with it, right? And they critique that in that center document there is his after action report. And in his after action report, it's what's normally leveled at the operation. Hey, this went wrong, this went wrong, this is what we got to fix, this is what we got to fix. So he's already very well aware of what went wrong and what needs to be right. So he's very astute at what he's doing. The navigation was wrong. Flying over the Navy, how did we thought the Navy wasn't going to fire at us. Why did we fly directly over the Navy? Why didn't we go in this direction? What about where the drop zones were? So he is already cognizant of sort of all of what went wrong and is trying his best to fix it. It's just start out something major, you're gonna unfortunately cost lives. You're gonna make mistakes. Right?
But you can see why someone who is finding fault with the system is going to be used again, rather than someone who tries to find a reason to blame another human being. And as you mentioned earlier, there have been some sort of rather people airing their dirty laundry in public kind of thing going on. Is that if a general or admiral or air command or whatever feels that they're being attacked personally, they might have a tendency to react to that. And that's the situation we're in currently with the US right now in 2025. But if you criticize a system, it's not personal, isn't it? He seems to be quite astute in from what you're saying, in just identifying the issues, but without being personal, without being, bitter about it. Just saying, this isn't working. Here are the solutions.
Yeah, that's the key. I think he offers a way to fix it. He just doesn't criticize.
Exactly. That's it. Right. It's not just picking holes. It's saying, but if we do this, we can correct that. There's someone saying, I get that on the channel saying, I don't like your channel, but they don't explain why. I go, well, how am I supposed to change it then? Or if you think I'm doing something wrong, explain what it is. But this is fascinating stuff. It's an insight into how to be a good human being, as well as being, as we're calling it, the master of the tactical airlift. Just good at being a team player.
His efficiency reports, which are, I've got him from the 20s all the way to the 50s. Is often described as a pleasant person, which sounds like an insult, right? As a commander, but it's actually key in order to make something happen. He's not fired, and there he is around key leaders, and Gavin and Ridgway and Taylor, they all trust him when they're going to make the plan. So it's that building that team and coming up with a solution. So. After this, it's already known where he's going. He's going to go to the 9th Troop Carrier Command. He leaves the theater in December to go up there and visit, just to check in on what's happening with it. There's already a commander of the 9th Troop Carrier Command, General Giles, who's had a experience in Transport Command. But Giles he's out. He's going to go to Persia, basically. So Williams somehow stays in the command of Troop Carrier. Even though these other guys who are experienced, they just know Williams is going to be doing it. Williams is going to be doing it. Williams is going to be doing it. So he comes up and he takes 9th Troop Carrier Command. He comes up in February of 44, after Eisenhower and Montgomery and all those, and Bradley are already up here. But what he did send up earlier in November was a guy named Bagby, Colonel Bagby, who's famous for some different things, like getting on a plane on the eve of D-Day and going into D-Day when he wasn't supposed to. And he's a character unto himself. But he was his chief of staff, so he sends him up in November of 43 to help start planning. All right, that's the same time Gavin leaves the 82nd and comes up and to start help planning. Who's already there? General Lee in the 101st Airborne Division is already up there. right? And then Giles with 9th Troop Carrier Command with a couple of troop carrier groups are already up there planning. So they're building this little cohort to go into Cossack, which then is going to roll into shape about planning for Neptune. And Williams is already thinking through what do I need to do it, and he's taking all those experiences with him from the Mediterranean up to England. And not only does he take the experiences, he takes the personnel. So he brings up most of his staff that he has worked with and that he trusts up into the UK to fill out 9th Troop Carrier Command. Joel Crouch, who had been working on the Pathfinder, the Army Air Forces side of the Pathfinder, right? That's under Williams in Sicily and Italy. He takes Crouch up there. And then the 82nd is already working on their Pathfinder teams, that air ground team of it. And so he brings those up there into the UK again, because he sees what will work. And then also force structure and how do you connect where you go. So on this map here, it's the troop carrier map, but I've also got labeled in where the 2 divisions are. So why are the troop carrier guys where they are? Why are the airborne guys where they are? What I don't have on there is where all the other forces are. Right? So initially, that northern cluster of airfields, that's where the Troop Carrier Command was supposed to go, but in the initial plannings, but there was no airborne division. The 101st shows up in September, October of 43, but they're sent down there where they're on that map. So they kind of shift some of the troop carrier groups that are going to move them down to the south, and then they take over those airfields there. The 82nd comes up in December to Northern Ireland. They're brought over in February because of these big decisions to increase the number of airborne forces. So they move up into the northern part around the Grantham Lodge in Leicester and all that kind of stuff. And that's where the 2 forces are essentially. Now, to deploy these forces into Neptune, you're going to send the paratroopers and you're going to send the glider forces. Up there around Nottingham is pretty far from Normandy. And down around Reading, it's pretty close to Normandy. So you're going to have to figure out, where am I going to send the 82nd glider guys from? So he has to, with Ridgway, they make the decision to send all the glider guys down around where the 101st Airborne is. So what you get on Neptune, on those airfields, there is a mixture of 82nd and 101st. 101st gliders are paratroopers, 82nd glider guys, right? Why is that important? Well, because Williams is thinking about, my mission is to deliver these airborne guys to their wherever they need to go. And not only do I need to figure out where the DZs and LZs are, but I have to think through all the steps in order to get them to the point where I can take off with them. And it's this massive, complex arrangement. It's planning, it's logistics, it's intelligence, it's personnel. And Williams basically takes this large force, it's 14 troop carrier groups. It is the largest troop carrier command organization ever. Yeah. Right? It's about what did I think? It's about 28,000 people, right? And it's some 1,000 airplanes, power airplanes, and then there's all the logistics piece behind it. And each airfield it's just this massive thing that he has to assemble in order to get these guys onto the ground into Normandy, right? And just as an example, this is just one troop carrier group. It's RAF Welford, the 435th Troop Carrier Group. And if you look on the list, the top part are the organizations that the troop carrier group controls. The ones with the 1X, the single X, belong to 9th Troop Carrier Command. The 3Xs is 9th Air Force, and then the 4Xs are it's the other forces. So Williams is in charge of all that first, none with the Xs, and then all the way down with the single Xs. And this is just one of about 20 stations, right? So he has this massive force underneath him. So not only does he need to think about the tactical planning, he also has to think about the admin planning and the logistical planning, and such a thing as who's going to award an air medal, right? Which doesn't sound like a big deal. But when you're the participant, getting your medal is actually a big deal. Is it going to be the wing? Is it going to be the command? What kind of medals are we going to issue? Is it going to be an air medal? Is it going to be a distinguished flying cross? And then he has to work out all these details, keeping in mind the morale of his men, right? And then actually there's women too, because the medical evacuation squadrons have nurses. And so they also belong to the next Troop Carrier Command. So he's got a mix of that.
You mentioned morale there because things didn't go perfectly for airborne troops in Sicily, but nevertheless, out of it was born this spirit, this credo. People like James Gavin and some of the 82nd commanders, like in the 504th and the 505th, and some of the British guys who are there as well. Out of it was born a a grittiness, and some of the planning may have been a bit off, and some of the jumps may have not worked, but out of it was born a these guys can actually do it. But I would kind of argue that the troop carriers and the delivery system was definitely, fingers were pointing and morale was low. So, in England, does he have to, not only is he working on the organization, the structure, and the minutiae of just managing such a large formation, but had the Sicily experience left people the organization at a low point?
My take on it would be no.
Right.
If anything, that this when Husky 2 or happens and the Navy shoots down the planes, the normal figures are given for the paratroopers are killed. Well, who else was killed? Right? Troop carrier guys were killed too. So there's casualties there. So that was a one-off kind of thing. And the 52nd Troop Carrier Wing comes up to the UK. But what's in the UK prior to that is the 50th Troop Carrier Wing with units from the States. And then it's going to come the 52nd Troop Carrier Wing. I mean, the 50th, the 53rd. These are all stateside guys coming over and flowing in there. So they don't have they don't know what's happened in the Mediterranean. Actually,
they're
even in
not
the States.
burdened by that. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, right. Because that doesn't get released for quite some time, right? What happened?
Fair enough. Fair point.
It's an accidental release later on. And so they know what they are. They're professional airmen. They think of themselves, I think, a little different than fighters and bombers, right? They're unarmed. They joke they're unarmored, and there's no weapons, and so they have to fly into combat. They are a combat force. That's what they think of themselves. But they're even tougher than the fighters and bombers because they've got no weapons and no protection. And so they sit in this kind of funny place where, like, similar to the glider pilots, they're not fighters and bombers, and they're not ground guys, and they're not supply guys, but they're going to fly into combat and then fly back, and so they are combat airmen. Not everybody thinks of them that way because they fly supplies and transports. But what are they transporting? Which is these combat guys into a combat zone. So I think that their morale is. I think it's. I think like most of the guys in the UK for Bolero, they know what's going to happen and that they're going to be part of it, and it's going to be a big deal.
Okay, thank you.
And I think like, when do you go home in World War II? Once the war's over, right? There's no. I'm in the theater for 12 months, and then I go home. I'm in the theater for 6 months, then I go home. These guys are the only way they're going home is to keep going forward, right? And I think that's a key kind of part of it. There are little things they jump. It's after Neptune, but that emblem there, the Ninth Air Force, they get authorized to stick an airborne tab over the Ninth Air Force when you're a troop carrier, right? Which doesn't sound like a big deal maybe to an outsider, but that marks you as different than the rest of the Ninth Air Force, right?
Okay, thank you.
And these are some, the pictures on the right. What does he have to do? Well, he has to do training, which is the top right. They have to bring supplies to even within the UK, Northern Ireland, and then they have to do casualty evacuation. There are casualties in training and accidents, so they're still moving casualties around the United Kingdom, even though they're not from the battles in the continent yet. Planning and this is what makes or breaks commander and a larger higher headquarters. It's the planning staffs and the conferences between them. And so you get personnel, intelligence, operations, logistics, planning. And so you have to have professionals be able, because the commander can't be everywhere and do everything. So when he sits down or she sits down at the table, what they want are competent staff officers who say, sir, ma'am, here are 3 different ways we could do this. And then it's up to the commander to weigh all those risks and make that decision to go with, all right, we're going to go with the second plan. And again, as I said, Williams brings up his staff from the Mediterranean. The guy up on the right, Colonel Glenn Jones, he's with them until after the war. So they worked really well as a team, and he liked them. They worked, and so he liked having people who were competent around him, which as a commander makes your job so much easier if you have competent staff officers. And I think one of the keys to leadership isn't yelling and shouting and motivating somebody in a foxhole. It's knowing how to pick the staff in order to be able to get the job done. Right?
And delegate.
And I think delegate. And Williams is good at doing that, right? And in his efficiency reports, he's not a guy who's yelling. He's a guy who trusts but verifies his staff. So he's not telling him and he's not micromanaging him. He's saying, hey, this is what we got to do. He lets his staff do the work. The staff comes back, he makes the decision, and then they go forward. And I think that's one of the secrets of his success to be the commander. At this time, he has to also deal with something called CATR, which is the Combined Air Transport Operations Room, which is all the supply that's not combat related. So I need gas, I need something such from the ground forces goes up and it goes into CATR. CATR looks at what's available transport wise, and CATR then talks to Williams and says, hey, we got to do this. And Williams has to decide, okay, well, I'll take that squadron to fly this and I'll do this kind of thing. So he's got a lot on his plate, including making equipment decisions. We're at an hour here, so I won't go too much longer. But equipment decisions, like up on the top left-hand side is a C-47 on the left and a C-46 on the right. You know, you start out with the C-47 because that's the only plane you've got. Essentially, the C-46s start to come into theater. Now Williams has to decide, am I going to use the C-46, right? And I think probably some of the varsity shows have talked about the pluses and the minuses of the C-46 versus the C-47, right? But does Williams make that decision himself? He can't, because who's going to drop out of that airplane? So he has to work with Ridgway, in this case, as the 18th Airborne Corps commander, to say, hey, we've got this new technology. This is the positive side of it. What do you think of it? And they test it in varsity one squadron. It has teething issues still, even though it's been in production for a number of years. And it doesn't work out, and they choose not to use it again. And they stick with the C-47, and they develop something called the C-82 and the C-119 later. But Williams had to make that call about, okay, I got this new technology. It could plus up things, but I got to work with the ground guys in order to do it. Ground guys say no, they don't use it anymore. Same on the bottom hand, the gliders there, the CG-4A and the Horsa. We use the Horsas once, the United States, and that's in Neptune, and we never use them again. And if I understand it correctly, it was Ridgway largely responsible for saying, I'm not going to use Horsas again. And it's because I think of the way they got used in Neptune, right? They're big gliders in small fields on wet grass, right? And they slide and they break. And so I think there's an idea that they were more fragile than the CG-4A, even though they could hold a hell of a lot more than a CG-4A. And so Williams, even though the CG-4A the Horsa would be a better way to bring more forces in quickly, has to listen again to the ground guys and Ridgway saying, we're not using Horsas again. We're just not doing it. But
we had this
also
discussion, I think it was with Monique Taylor, that there's this kind of fork in the road where the British and the Duke forces kind of keep on going with the Horsa because they love it. And the US goes the CG-4 route because they kind of like the smaller, more compact. And they both like the glider they're using and can't quite understand why the other lot are using the other glider. But I think it's a fascinating. It's just sort of cultural and experience they've had, and it's a fascinating little kind of divergence that occurs. But it's loyalty based as well, isn't it?
Yeah. There's a bit of technological thing, which an air guy understands too. The Horsa is a big glider. And for a C-47 to tug a Horsa, it's at max power, right? It takes a lot of the energy of the C-47 to do it. Well, 38 Group has bombers.
Yeah, they have Sterlings. Yeah, different point. Yeah.
And
exactly.
so, Williams looking at it going, okay, well, if we're going to use Horsas, then we got to either make them lighter in their load, or we got to figure out a different airplane, right? And he wasn't going to get a different airplane. He was only going to get C-47s.
Yeah, good point.
And then on the top right hand side is, the resupply is key. They would just kick the door bundles out, and then he gets introduced to this rail system, which he gets from the Brits, and so it can drop a lot quicker. So then he says, okay, well, that's a good idea, which sounds simple, but then what do you have to get in order to make that happen? You got to get all the bits and bobs. You got to get it put inside of the airplanes. The air guys aren't trained to do it, so you got to get the Army's Quartermaster Corps to come in to be units to pack them, put them in the airplanes, and then get them out of the airplanes. And so now you're going to put other people inside the airplanes. Williams is all for it because it can you can do a resupply drop much quicker, but there's a lot of steps in order to be able to get it done, right? And then down other simple things like on the bottom right-hand side, there's a Brit paratrooper on the right and a US paratrooper on the left. And I use that picture because the US paratrooper is about to hook into his static. He's on a static line, which is on the top of the airplane. And the Brit static line is down where the seats are. Right. So you did a C-47 in the theater. What do you have to do? You're going to do US or UK. Williams kept asking the U.S. factories to put in both systems. So when a C-47 showed up in theater, it was ready to go either way. And it just never happened. So it had to be
Clever
modified
stuff.
once it's in the theater to be able to drop, because you can't do it. And he had to move the antenna, an IFF antenna, and a few other things in order to make it so that a Brit paratrooper could jump out of the airplane versus a U. So Williams has got to make all these kinds of decisions. Almost done. And then these are just some key players in the European theater that Williams has to deal with. On the top left, there's Williams on the right, shaking hands with the 435th Group Commander in front of the wing commander. So he not only has to deal outside, like you're talking about morale, outside of the 9th Troop Carrier Command, he has to deal inside the 9th Troop Carrier Command, morale, leadership, all that kind of stuff. Listen to them and how they're going to execute. On the right hand side, there's Williams talking to Joel Crouch. I'm not sure, this is right around D-Day, before or after. I'm not quite sure when this photo was taken, but it's right around the 6th of June. I think it's after the 6th. I think it's after when Crouch comes back. So the Pathfinder force. Down on the bottom right-hand side, again, he's a guy. He's a team player. He's affable. He's standing next to Lee Mallory, which is a whole different subject. You either like him or don't like him. I think most people don't like him. Unfortunately, he died, so we don't really get this thing. Next to Lee Mallory is Brereton, who's the head of the 9th Air Force, who's going to become the head of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, another personality that you've got to be able to get along with. Now, Williams and Brereton knew each other from the 30s, so they already had an established relationship. And then on the center is obviously Ridgway and Gavin, and then Taylor. He's got to work with the American paratrooper generals. And then down on the bottom is Browning, and then over on the left is Urquhart, standing next to Williams. This is after Arnhem. There's a little news clip of them where Urquhart's saying thank you for delivering my forces in a precise manner. It doesn't talk about the part afterwards. And then down in that other RAF officer, that's Hollinghurst. So he's the 38th Group Commander, 38th Group Commander. So he's kind of Williams' equivalent, but because the Brits have such a smaller force, Williams is always the Air Task Force Commander, and the Brits serve under him for an operation. And so they have to work together too. Now, Williams stays on. Hollinghurst, and I'm not quite sure what happens after Market Garden. Browning is going to go to Southeast Asia. Lee Mallory is going to go to Southeast Asia, and Hollinghurst goes to Southeast Asia. So I don't know if inside the Brit leadership they said after Market Garden, this was all cocked up. You guys are fired. And I'm not trying to insult Southeast Asia, but I get a sense that if you're in the British Army or the RAF and you're in the European theater and you get sent to Southeast Asia, it's kind of a punishment. Am I wrong in that?
Yeah, no, sort of. It's a sideways sort of, just on the naughty step for a bit, maybe, yeah.
And then I'll finish up here. Williams retired. He stays as a troop carrier. He comes back to the States after the war. He heads 9th Troop Carrier Command, which gets turned into the 3rd Air Force, and then it gets turned into the 9th Air Force. And he's all troop carrier up until Air Force independence in 47. And then he's pushed, he changes jobs to the 2nd and 10th Air Force Commander, which is training the reserve forces. So he's the airborne guy, right? As this is the newspaper article there for his retirement. He's the airborne expert. But when the Air Force becomes independent in 47, they really want nothing to do with the ground, right? They told Vandenberg and Spots and those guys told Ike, because he's going to be the chief of staff. He said, if you back the independence, we'll always have a tactical air command for you, and we'll always be there. And when the Air Force gets independent in 47, on paper there's a tactical air command with stuff, but in reality they're going in a very different direction. Williams is one of those guys who doesn't go in that direction. And they're in 1948, Jim Gavin and Paul Williams meeting up. Gavin is the chief of staff of the Fifth Army at the time. Williams is the 2nd Air Force commander, and they're at some event in the central United States. And you could just see I don't think those are fake smiles, right?
Yeah, it looks
those
real.
Are two guys who absolutely respect one another. They're both major generals. Gavin goes on to become a lieutenant general, and Williams retires in a couple of years. And so Williams is the guy who kicks off the tactical air and then takes the troop carrier, the airborne piece of it, but he's just not known. My goal is to help make him known some way. That's Williams in a nutshell in World War II. But
it's interesting at the end there that he's He's not quite an Air Force, enough of an Air Force guy to carry on with the Air Force because he's been contaminated by being with the ground guys. Yeah, he's not really been accepted by the ground guys, so he can't. So he's like an orphan. You know, he's like stuck between, like in a divorce. He's the kid that in the divorce, no one quite knows which parent to put him with. It's fascinating. He's sort
That's
of
that's not an old thing, because even in the modern Air Force, the tactical air control parties or the combat weather guys, they are still they're in this kind of strange zone. They're not Air Force enough, they're not blue enough, and they're not green enough. So that tension still exists. Sorry.
Yeah, I like the fact in the emails to me you compared him to Leslie McNair, and I think there is definitely a parallel there of someone who's good at what they do, which some people can find a bit suspicious. Some people, like, you know, that they're not jealous as such, but like, you know, he's pretty good at everything, and he seems to have got the diplomacy thing down well. He's obviously a good organizer. People can be a bit mistrustful of that, like, just, you know, he's too good to be true. It's really interesting. But the comment just came in from Nicholas Moss there, but, you know, but about your, you know, the comment about some of the people going to Southeast Asia. So Operation Market Garden was essentially Brereton Williams' operation in its execution. So don't get that thinking personally about them getting punished. So to take,
I don't know what that means,
then,
but I don't know if I agree with it.
okay, well, we're allowed to disagree on things. That's all the fun. But it's interesting, you know, we've over the years of all the, I mean, this is a massive rabbit hole. We're not going to spend 20 minutes on this, but it's traditionally all the fingers have been pointed at Montgomery for Market Garden. Recently, thanks to, you know, you coming on the channel and talking about, we're starting to expand the circle of guilt to include Brereton. Williams, he's part of the mix. Surely, you know, he has to be. Do you think?
I didn't get to it, but that's you know, that's the whole the two lift thing. They should do two lifts. I don't think it was feasibly, you know, they were going to do it for Linnet, and they were going to do this for Comet. Linnet was much closer. You can't do a double tow from the airfields in the UK to Holland. Williams had been advocating to bring the troop carrier groups onto the continent in the fall of 1944, so they would be closer to the front, so they could execute operations with more force. The problem was that the fighters and the bombers, the B-26s and the P-47s, P-38s were using the airfields. Second half was using the airfields. So it's a matter of how do you get them on there. Williams said they couldn't do two airlifts. Well, there's all kinds of stuff. It's shorter days, longer routes, more wear on the engines. And if by chance they got hit hard, either by by flak or by the Luftwaffe, they wouldn't be able to do the second lift that day, right? So so Williams made a call as an experienced officer to do one a day. And in theory, you know, there's a Neil Ritchie, I think, an RAF historian.
Sebastian Ritchie.
Hours. Yeah, 45 hours from start to finish for the three lifts. It's not 3 days, right, in planning. So it's actually fairly tight group there. Now, weather is going to come into play. That's beyond, you know, you got to watch weather in the continent, got to watch weather over the channel, got to watch weather over the UK. And I think the idea when Monty and Browning are coming up with this, they're not thinking that way.
The other thing I think just worth mentioning very briefly is that you can definitely see things with like tank design. You can see the evolution of the wartime tanks becoming the next generation of tanks. You can see that with, you know, the fighters and the Gloucester Meteor and things like that, and the things the US were doing with jets in Korea. But as Monique Taylor says when she comes on talks about gliders, helicopters changed the whole air transport aspect eventually.
I disagree with that, because helicopters don't become viable until the late 50s. What becomes viable is the C-82 and the C-119 doing heavy drop.
Right. Okay.
To get the heavy drop, the guns and the jeeps, right? A helicopter can't actually lift anything for a very long time. They still can't. It's the C-82, C-119, C-130. Okay. That's the game changer, because now you can bring in the guns and the jeeps right with the paratroopers, which means you don't need a glider anymore.
Okay, that makes point. That makes a point. Yeah, that's good stuff. Well, I love these conversations, Jeff. So, but we will bring things to an end. So, folks, don't forget to remind to click like and subscribe. Visit my guests' websites, buy their books, etc., etc. Steve Zaloga's on tomorrow talking about the anniversary or 81st anniversary of the Battle of Carenton, the liberation of Carenton. Looking forward to that. Norma Graham is coming on the next day talking about the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. Then I've got a break. Saturday, Ben Powers is coming on talking about 82nd Airborne Artillery in Normandy, which is always cool. So as always, thank you very much, Jeff, for a fantastic presentation. Lots to think about, and I think we've done a little bit of to kind of bring Paul Williams back into the mix again of people that are involved in a very important development of a new force, of a means of getting people to war. So thank you very much. So cheers, everybody. See you all tomorrow.
Thanks, watchers.
Bye.